The Real Beauty and the Beast, a cursed prince erased by his own kingdom. In a forgotten corner of a broken kingdom buried beneath layers of rewritten history and royal lies, there once lived a boy who was born into power but never into peace. The people called him many things, Hair Prince Beast and traitor, but never by his name. And that was exactly what the crown wanted. He was their darkest secret. A child who was never supposed to survive yet somehow did, and every breath he took became a threat to the legacy they were building. They say he was cursed, but no one ever asked who cast it, or why. Only that one day the castle that crowned the hill began to whisper at night, and the boy in the tallest room stopped speaking and started roaring the story. They told the world was simple. A vain, selfish prince who rejected love was punished, turned into a monster until one brave girl saw past the fur and found the man within, and that love broke the spell. But that story was a lie. The real boy, the real beast was born not of magic, but of betrayal locked away. Not by a witch, but by his own blood, and the girl who came to save him. She didn't arrive with love in her heart, but with questions in her mind and revenge behind her eyes. The girl they call Beauty wasn't looking for a fairy tale, she was hunting for the truth, and what she found was far more monstrous than anyone ever imagined, because the curse wasn't on the prince, it was on the people who created him. She arrived in the dead of winter snow, thick as ash and wind, sharp as blades. The villagers warned her that the castle was alive, that things moved on their own, and shadows didn't wait for nightfall. But she didn't flinch. She had grown up on the edges of war in towns where soldiers came before the sun and left nothing but smoke behind. She wasn't afraid of haunted halls. She was afraid of silence, the kind that follows a question no one wants answered. Her name wasn't Belle. Not really. It was Isabeau, and she wasn't some peasant girl with her nose in books. She was the daughter of a scholar exiled for uncovering royal records that didn't match the stories told in schools. She came because her father died mysteriously 2 days after requesting access to one particular file, the birth record of the firstborn prince, the one who supposedly died as a baby, but whose signature appeared on a sealed military order. 3 years later, Isabeau didn't believe in fairy tales, she believed in evidence, and she believed her father was murdered for finding it. The castle was crumbling, yet somehow it watched her each step, echoing against walls that hadn't heard laughter in decades. Mirrors cracked just enough to suggest violence paintings slashed across the eyes, as if someone wanted every memory to forget how to see, and in the great hall at the end of it all sat the thing they called the Beast. Not a creature, not a monster, but a man whose body bore scars so deep they seemed to pulse with old screams, tall, broad, wrapped in furs, but his eyes weren't wild. They were tired, hollow, not from rage, but from being abandoned for too long. He didn't roar. He didn't lunge. He looked at her and said, "So you came to finish it." And those were the first words he'd spoken in 7 years. She didn't flinch, didn't lie. She said, "I came to understand why they hid you," and he laughed the kind of laugh that sounds like it remembers crying. He said, "Then you're already too close, because understanding is what got everyone killed." She stayed not because of pity, not because of fear, but because the more she asked, the more the walls cracked with truth. He told her stories of his mother, a healer accused of witchcraft after saving a noble child who later died of plague, of his father, the king who remarried and erased every sign of his firstborn, of servants who disappeared after hearing too much, and ministers who sealed away the castle like burying a body without a grave. They called him cursed because they needed a reason for his isolation, because saying the king ordered it would raise questions no one wanted to answer. He showed her the library, dusty with sealed letters from allies who never received replies, the armory rusted with weapons never used in defense, and the ballroom that once held diplomats now overgrown with moss and silence. The curse wasn't magic, it was neglect. Exile, punishment wrapped in a lie too elegant to be questioned, and Isabeau saw it all, not with fairy tale eyes, but with a mind trained to see patterns and truths. and missing names, and she realized something no one else dared say. The beast was never the villain he was. The evidence, the living, breathing truth that the kingdom had rewritten its past to look pure and glorious while burying its shame in fur and fangs. Each day she stayed the story they both knew began to unravel, not into romance, but into revelation. And on the seventh day, as storms roared across the mountains and the villagers locked their doors, she uncovered the final piece, the edict signed by the king, sealing the fate of the firstborn. Not because of cruelty, but fear. The prince had seen something in court, a betrayal, a foreign pact that could ruin the royal line. And instead of silencing the enemies, the king silenced his own son, branding him mad, dangerous, cursed. And when Isabeau showed him the document, the beast didn't cry, he didn't scream. He simply said, "I knew I wasn't crazy." And in that moment, his posture changed, not with magic, but with memory. He stood taller, not because a spell broke, but because a truth was finally spoken aloud. And sometimes that's all a curse really is, a lie wrapped in silence, waiting to be named. But the kingdom didn't forget. They watched the castle even when they pretended it didn't exist. And when they saw lights again, when they heard rumors of a girl in the beast's lair, they acted swift and brutal. Not with swords, but with stories. They declared her kidnapped. They branded him a threat, and they marched on the castle with fire and banners painted with false grief. They didn't come to save her. They came to finish what they started to kill the past one final time, and what happened that night would never be printed in books, but it burned in the memories of everyone who saw the smoke rise from the hill and heard the girl's scream echo across the valley, not in fear, but in fury. And that fury didn't die with the flames. It spread like a secret passed from mother to daughter, father to son, whispered in corners of schools and woven into lullabies forgotten by scholars but remembered by hearts who knew that truth doesn't disappear. Just because it's forbidden, it waits, it lingers. It claws through cracks in stone and blood, and one day it returns. Not with vengeance, but with clarity. And when it does, history has no choice but to look in the mirror and see what it tried to erase. The fire did not kill him, though it came close. The villagers thought they saw the castle burn to the ground, but stone does not give in so easily, and neither did he hidden in the crypts beneath the eastern wing. He waited through the screams, through the smoke, through the silence that followed. And when he emerged days later, the only thing left standing was a fractured tower, and a girl with ash in her hair and blood on her dress, holding a torn page from a royal ledger, and whispering over and over he was never the monster. The wind carried her voice through the valleys, but no one came to listen. They had already celebrated their victory, rewritten the tale, and moved on with a story more comforting than the truth, because truth is messy. It blames the wrong people and makes heroes out of those who were supposed to be forgotten. Isabeau knew this. She knew the moment she returned to her village and saw the looks of pity and suspicion. She knew when her name was left off the town records and her father's work was confiscated and never returned. They didn't want survivors, they wanted silence, and she refused to give it to them. She began to write. Not fairy tales, not poems, but testimony. Every detail, every contradiction, every sealed document she had seen in that castle. She wrote it all down in her own blood if she had to, and buried copies in places no fire could reach, because she understood something that most never do. Stories aren't passed down because they are sweet. They are passed down because someone refuses to let them die. The beast, if one could still call him that, wandered the countryside not in search of redemption, but in search of memory. The more he walked, the more he realized how far the kingdom had gone to erase him. Statues, torn down portraits, replaced with others' names removed from textbooks, schools built over graveyards where loyal servants were buried without markers. And in every village he passed, Children were taught about a brave young prince who died in infancy and how his death united the realm and brought peace. What they didn't teach was that he had lived, that he had loved, that he had bled, and that the peace they cherished was bought with betrayal and silence. He saw his own face, once carved into a fountain, now vandalized with words like monster and freak, and he didn't cry. He didn't rage. He simply sat at its edge and waited for the rain to wash the words away, because he knew the world always forgets, until it can no longer afford to. Isabeau joined him again months later, after being chased from town to town, accused of sedition for the crime of remembering. She found him outside the ruins of a burned chapel, where once a queen had prayed for her son's protection, now just charred beams and scorched stone. She sat beside him and said, "They've erased everything," and he said, "Then let's write it back." Not with swords or sermons, but with survival. They moved in secret gathering. Those who still remembered those who had served in silence. Those who had questioned the story but been too afraid to ask. They weren't many at first. A librarian with trembling hands, a former guard with scars across his back, a maid who had hidden the prince's toys in her apron the day he vanished. They all came not for vengeance, but for witness. They wanted the truth, not as justice, but as restoration, to say that it happened, that he lived, that they failed him, but they would not forget him, and together they built something. No king could burn a book. Not one of spells or fairy tales, but of truth, handwritten, unpolished, filled with names, places, details that had been buried beneath centuries of lies, and they called it the Chronicle of the Beast, not as an insult, but as an honor, because the word had been used to shame him, and they would use it to remember him. But word travels even when whispered, and the crown heard rumors of a rising legend of a cursed prince returned, and a girl who loved him enough to defy the throne, and so they sent men not in armor, but in cloaks, with poison in their rings and bribes in their pockets. They didn't come to kill. They came to rewrite, offering gold to those who would burn the chronicle and titles to those who would call the girl mad, but she saw through it all. And when they cornered her in a barn outside the northern cliffs, she looked them in the eye and said, "I am not afraid of death, only of dying forgotten," and she lit the fire herself, burning the copies they had found, but not before sending others across the sea to hidden scholars and whispering travelers who carried the truth in their bags and hearts. And when they asked her why, she smiled and said, "Because stories don't live on shelves, they live in people. And as long as one remembers, he still exists." The beast watched her do all this not as a lover, not as a prince, but as a man who had been broken and was learning how to be whole again. He never asked her for love, and she never asked him to change. They were not the fantasy version. They were survivors. Not perfect, not healed, just alive and willing to fight for the memory of a boy who once roared, because no one would hear his voice. They didn't rebuild the castle. They didn't wear crowns. They lived among the people, quietly teaching them how to ask questions, how to see gaps in stories, how to follow whispers instead of commands, and one by one the kingdom began to shift, not with rebellion, but with doubt. And doubt is dangerous because it makes people look, and looking leads to remembering, and remembering leads to truth. Years passed, and the beast grew older, and so did she. And one night, as he sat beneath the stars, he said maybe the curse was never the fur or the fangs. Maybe it was believing I deserved to be forgotten. And she took his hand and said, maybe the curse was everyone who let you believe it. And in that moment he smiled. Not the smile of a prince or a monster, but of a man who knew he had not been erased. Not truly, not ever, because someone had loved him enough to fight for the story no one else would tell. The kingdom had no monument for him, no plaque, no statue, not even a name carved on an old wall, and yet his story would not die. It whispered through the cracks of old libraries buried in footnotes beneath stories of noble kings and golden ages. It lingered in lullabies sung by mothers who once knew better, and in side glances shared between elders who remembered the boy who vanished, and the castle that burned Isabeau kept moving. not because she was running, but because she had learned that truth must travel. If it is to survive, she left pieces of the chronicle everywhere, disguised in other stories, tucked behind false covers, hidden inside poems carved into walls of bathhouses, and pressed into the bindings of dusty recipe books, and slowly, without anyone realizing the story, began to rise again, not as a tale of a beast and a beauty, but of a boy betrayed, and a kingdom that fed on silence like wine. She visited old lands, places she had once heard about only in whispers, old villages that had once served the royal family, towns where the crest had been painted over, but still lived in stonework and iron gates. And in one such place she found a woman with eyes like the sea who told her something that changed everything, that she had been a handmaid to the queen, the boy's mother, and that before she died she had written a letter sealed in wax and blood and hidden it in the roots of an oak tree that once grew beside her son's cradle. And that letter contained the one truth. No one had dared speak aloud that the king had not merely erased his son, he had offered him in exchange for peace with an enemy kingdom, not to be killed, but to be taken to a place where no voice could reach, no map could find, and no prayer could follow. He had sold his own blood in a deal carved in desperation and inked in cowardice, and that betrayal was not a fairy tale curse, it was policy. It was history scrubbed clean. The beast, now older, slower but sharper than ever, listened to this story not with rage, but with clarity. He said, "I always wondered why the men who came that night wore foreign rings and spoke broken dialect. Now I know they weren't there to kill me. They were there to deliver me." And when he held that letter, trembling and scorched from time, he whispered, "I remember her fingers brushing my face as they took me away," and she said, "I'm sorry," louder than the guard screamed, and he folded the letter without another word, because he didn't need more proof, he needed peace, and peace never came from vengeance, only from truth being seen and spoken. They traveled again this time to the borderlands, places where the royal law cracked, and other rulers whispered they met with scribes who had saved fragments of old records, clerks who had once served under aliases to protect themselves, and even an old priest who remembered baptizing a child whose name was blacked out hours after the ceremony, and all of them had one thing in common: they knew the truth but had no voice to speak it. And now, with the beast standing in front of them with his scars and silence and unwavering gaze, they found their voices again, not loud, not grand, but steady, like stones placed one by one to build a path back to memory. And that path led to a single, undeniable fact, that the kingdom owed its golden age not to unity, but to erasure, and that everything built since had stood on the silence of a boy who was never supposed to grow old enough to tell his story. Isabeau wrote the final volume of the Chronicle herself by candlelight, by firelight, by the flickering torches of rebels and thinkers and poets who believed that truth, no matter how ugly, was sacred, and that volume contained the names, the documents, the confessions, the letters, and the testimony of the man who had once been called Beast, and now chose no title at all, just a name that had not been spoken in decades. Julian, son of Queen Aline, rightful heir of a crown he no longer wanted but would no longer let deny him. And when she read the final words aloud to a room of strangers, she said, "This is not a tale of magic. This is a tale of memory." And they stood not in applause but in silence, because they understood that silence was how it had started and silence could not be how it ended. But the palace had ears, and those ears belonged to a new generation, a prince whose blood carried the guilt of a grandfather who had built an empire on the backs of shadows. And when that prince read the Chronicle, when he saw the faces of those his family had buried in myth, he did something no one expected. He did not send soldiers. He did not send lies. He sent himself on horseback with no crown and no guards to the house where the beast now lived, a quiet home beside a river where gardens bloomed without permission and dogs barked without fear. And when Julian opened the door, the prince bowed and said, "I am here not to ask for forgiveness, but to return something stolen." And from his coat he pulled a crest, not made of gold, but of iron bent and scorched the original sigil of the old line of queens, the one erased after Julian disappeared. And he said, I found it in the vault beneath the chapel, hidden behind the new crest welded in shame and fear. And I believe it belongs to you. And Julian did not take it, but he smiled and said, then history is listening again, and that is enough. The chronicle was published quietly, under no banner with no author's name, in old towns and new cities, and whispered markets and candle-lit schools, and people read it not as myth, but as mirror, and as they did, they began to ask their own questions about their own histories, their own stories, and soon it was not just about one prince, it was about all those who had been cast as monsters, so others could stay kings and queens, and slowly the language changed. The word beast stopped meaning cursed and started meaning survivor. The word beauty stopped meaning savior and started meaning seeker. And those words echoed in places the crown could no longer reach. And when Julian died many years later, not alone, not hated, not forgotten, they did not bury him in the royal tombs, but beneath the same oak tree where his mother's letter had waited, and on the stone they carved, not prince, not beast, but simply his name, and below it the words, the curse, was silence, and we broke it. The stone over his grave became more than a marker. It became a pilgrimage, not for those who wanted fairy tales, but for those who needed truth, for the broken, for the misnamed, for the erased. It became a place where people whispered their real names. Names. They were told to hide or forget names tied to lineages that were rewritten to suit someone else's glory. People came from corners of the kingdom where maps had stopped being updated, from deserts that were called wastelands, and from islands that never bowed to royal rule. They came not to ask for miracles, but to remember out loud, and the air around that oak tree carried the weight of their voices layered with sorrow and strength and defiance and love, because they knew now what the old stories had tried to bury, that a kingdom that silences one of its own can never truly call itself whole, and that every erased person leaves behind a crack in the mirror of power, and enough cracks will shatter any illusion, no matter how golden its frame. Isabeau never claimed any title for herself. She was called many things: rebel archivist, heretic, witch, but she never wore a crown or accepted a lord's estate. Instead, she kept walking map in hand, eyes on the horizon, teaching others how to read not just books, but between the lines of history, how to listen to what was not said, how to follow the gaps in family trees and the tremble in a storyteller's voice. She built schools in ruins where children could write what they saw, not what they were told, and where no one flinched when a child asked, "But what if the prince wasn't a beast? What if the people were?" And when she spoke to crowds gathered in barns, in marketplaces, in courtyards that had once echoed with royal decrees, she told them not the tale of a romance, but of a resurrection, not of magic, but of memory. And each time she ended with the same words, "Speak their names," and the silence dies. But the crown did not stay silent forever. Regimes change, kings die, and sons inherit not just the throne, but the consequences. And the new monarch was a queen, young, sharp-raised on whispers and contradictions, who had once stumbled upon a battered copy of the Chronicle hidden beneath her tutor's floorboards, and read it by moonlight with shaking hands. And when she stood before her people for the first time, her crown still too large for her head, she said, "We are not the legacy of lies. We are the future of reckoning." And in her first royal act, she decreed the restoration of every name ever erased, every title stripped, every child hidden, and every grave unmarked, and she opened the royal archives to the public. And in doing so, she cracked the spine of the nation wide open, not to break it, but to let it breathe. And yet, not everyone welcomed it. There were still those who clung to the old myths, who called the Chronicle dangerous fiction, and who claimed the beast had bewitched the girl into writing it. Those who said that silence was safer, that forgetting was a kindness, and that digging up the past only stirred up the dead. But Isabeau stood firm, and so did those who had learned to read the truth in shadows. They reminded the world that it was not remembering that destroyed kingdoms, but the pretending that nothing ever needed to be remembered, that monsters were not born, they were declared, and if you declare someone enough times, the world will start to believe you even when the person in question is just a boy who wanted to live and love and be known. So they built something, not a monument, not a museum, but a living archive, carved into the bones of the old castle, which had stood empty for decades, a skeleton of shame and soot, and when the new queen asked Isabeau what to call it, she answered without pause, "Call it what it is, the House of the Erased." And so it became a sanctuary, a place where anyone whose story had been silenced could write their truth on the walls, in ink, in paint, in song, in flame. And each room told a different tale, not just Julian's, but those like him. The girl who was locked in a tower for seeing a secret, she shouldn't have the boy who vanished after revealing that a war had been started with forged letters, the baker who hid the last surviving child of a conquered people, and each story lit another lantern along the dark path back to honesty. Visitors came by the hundreds, some crying, some silent, some trembling. With the weight of recognition, they did not come for beauty, they came for truth. And sometimes the truth was hideous, but it was always holy, and in one room behind a veil of ivy, there stood a single mirror cracked from age, but still able to show a reflection, and beneath it the inscription, not, "Who do you see?" but "Who did they say you were?" And that question sat in the heart of every visitor, echoing long after they left, because it forced them to ask themselves whose story they were living and whose truth they were forgetting. Julian's name became part of the curriculum taught in every school, and not just as a prince but as a person, as a boy who suffered, a man who endured, and a symbol not of tragedy but of survival. And each year on the day he was taken from the palace, children lit candles at their doorsteps and told stories not of dragons or witches, but of how lies can wear crowns and truth can wear scars, and how both are still worth fighting for. And in that fight they carried forward the one thing the kingdom had tried hardest to kill, the memory of the boy who never stopped existing just because they stopped speaking his name. Isabeau lived long enough to see that day, to stand on the steps of the House of the Erased and watch as 1,000 voices rose in chorus, not in mourning, but in power. And when a young girl handed her a note saying, "Thank you for teaching me that truth matters more than magic," she wept, not because she was sad, but because it meant that she could finally rest. And when she passed, she asked to be buried not in the royal cemetery or the scholars' quarter, but beside Julian. Beneath the oak and on her stone, they carved no title, no epitaph, just one word written by his hand storyteller. And long after the last royal bloodline faded and borders changed and languages shifted, people still came to that tree. They came not for the past, but for the permission to tell their own truths. And when they sat beside those two stones, they did not whisper prayers. They whispered stories, and in every story the beast lived not as a caution, not as a curse, not as a villain, but as a boy whose roar had finally been heard. The wind still moves through the valley where the oak tree stands, and every time it does, it carries the scent of old paper and burnt stone, and voices that refuse to die. And if you stand there long enough with your ear close to the earth, you can almost hear them not as ghosts, not as echoes, but as a rhythm, as steady as a heartbeat. The sound of truth finally free. There is no castle now, only ruins wrapped in moss and shadow and memory. But memory is a strange thing. It knows how to survive in dust, in silence, in forgotten corners of children's bedtime stories, and it knows how to wait. Memory is patient. It waited as they called him. Cursed. It waited as they burned his name from the records. It waited as they painted him as a monster to protect their legacy. And it waited for someone brave enough to call it what it really was. Not a curse, not a beast, not a tragedy, but a lie wrapped in silk and crowned with gold. And once that lie was spoken aloud, once it cracked beneath the weight of Isabeau's pen and Julian's breath, and every name that followed it, the kingdom could never return to what it had been. Because a kingdom built on silence cannot stand when everyone starts to speak. They tried to write a fairy tale, but what they got was a reckoning. They wanted a legend about love conquering all. But what they got was a legacy, built by those who dared to name the pain and face it, not with swords or magic spells, but with truth and persistence and grit, because the real power in any kingdom is not in the throne, not in the bloodline, not in the armor or the anthem. It is in the story it tells. And the moment that story is questioned, the moment someone dares to say, "Wait, that's not what happened," that's when the walls start to shake, not from war, but from awakening. And that's why they called him Beast, not because he was violent, not because he was cruel, but because he remembered, and they could not allow the people to see the one they had erased, still breathing, still thinking, still human. So they covered him in fur and fangs and fear. They told children he had claws, so no one would ask what he had lost. They said he needed saving, so no one would wonder who hurt him first, and they made beauty the answer, so no one would question the crime. But Isabeau never came to save, she came to listen, to ask, to write, and in doing so, she did the one thing more powerful than breaking a curse: she made sure the silence never returned. There were others who followed, not just in that kingdom, but across oceans and mountains and time. There were girls who read her words and refused to sit down. Boys who heard his name and refused to accept the version in their textbooks, elders who whispered their real histories to grandchildren, and artists who painted what had been hidden for centuries, and every one of them carried the story forward, not as myth, but as movement, not as folklore, but as fuel. And in the end, that is how legends really live, not in stained glass windows or golden pages, but in the decision to speak, when silence would be easier to resist, when obedience is demanded, and to remember when forgetting has been bought and sold 1,000 times. And so the real story was never about a cursed prince and a beautiful girl. It was about a system built to erase those who would not bow, and the courage of those who refused to disappear. It was about a boy named Julian, who was never a monster, and a girl named Isabeau, who refused to let him be turned into one. And it was about all of us, because every time someone tells you your story doesn't matter, every time they say, "Stay quiet, stay small, be grateful, you are not forgotten," they are trying to put you back in that tower, in that castle, in that prison of silence. They are trying to call you a beast, because they know that if you speak, if you roar, if you write the truth, they cannot hold their power for long. And if you remember nothing else, remember this: the curse was never fur or claws or spells. It was silence, and silence only wins when we stop telling the truth, when we stop asking questions, when we stop remembering. And so long as someone dares to speak the name, they tried to erase Julian lives, and so do all the others whose names we are still learning to say. So, speak them all. Speak them loud. Speak them now. And if the world tells you that your story is too ugly, too complicated, too dangerous, tell them the tale of the boy they called Beast, and the girl who wrote him back into history, and remind them that the real curse was thinking we would ever stop telling the truth. Because monsters aren't born, they're made by the lies we accept. And heroes aren't chosen. They're built by those brave enough to listen when everyone else is too afraid. And the only magic that ever mattered was the power of memory refusing to die. So if you're watching this and your voice has been silenced, if your name has been stolen, if your truth has been buried under the story someone else wrote for you, then this is your moment, this is your mirror, this is your roar, and you are not alone. Because the curse is broken and we are the ones who broke it. Now speak and never stop.